everyone, welcome to this session. My name is Lauren Moy. I've been a data scientist at Deloitte for about 8 years now, where I've learned so much in AI, machine learning, working mostly in the government space. I'm very excited to facilitate this session today, hearing from all of our wonderful panelists as well. Just so you know, we will facilitate the discussion and then definitely opening it up for Q&A at the end. So if you want to put your questions in the link, we'll definitely work through answering your questions as well. So to kick us off, I want to give a brief introduction on what we'll be discussing today. So AI and machine learning are very powerful tools with the potential to revolutionize how organizations really deliver services to citizens. But like every powerful tool, AI comes with risks. So to help address those risks, mitigate those risks, organizations must think through the right controls for AI technology, enabling companies to advance society while functioning in a trustworthy, equitable, and ethical manner. AI algorithms don't have ethics within themselves. People have ethics. So if organizations want people to trust the outcomes of their AI tools, that they're ethical, they really need to build in ethics principles into the development of the tools themselves. So Deloitte's approach to trustworthy AI spans throughout the AI lifecycle, all the way from ideation to design, development, and deployment, anchored on 6 dimensions in Deloitte's trustworthy AI framework. These span from transparent and explainable, fair and impartial, robust and reliable, respectful of privacy, safe and secure, and responsible and accountable. So we're here today to discuss our collective experiences in applying thinking around AI ethics with our clients and helping organizations develop ethical safeguards. With that, I want to introduce our panelists. So I'd like each of you to please introduce yourselves and tell us how you see trustworthy AI issues making an impact for businesses and government. Daisy, we'll start with you on this question.
Great, thanks so much, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. Daisy Glotzhober here. Very excited to be participating on this panel with my colleagues. I am a data scientist and a manager at Deloitte. I have a background in economics and math and also studied a lot of statistics and computer science in college, and that's where I discovered my passion for coding as well as my interest in public sector economics, especially on topics like tax policy, education, and poverty. I kind of stumbled into consulting, which I found to be kind of this nice intersection of all of my interests, and that's where I've spent pretty much all 8+ years of my career consulting for government clients. I've been with Deloitte for about 4 years, and I'd say my proudest accomplishment to date, that's been sort of my passion project for the last 1.5 years, totally outside of client work, is the Women in Analytics training program that I kickstarted in my small little part of Deloitte. It's a training program to help internally develop women practitioners at the firm with data science skills that they can apply in their projects, because we don't have as many women data scientists in our practice as we'd like to see, and we're trying to change that. As far as how I see trustworthy AI impacting the government and businesses, I see it as something that should be a mandate. And I think that perspective is more and more being shared by many government and industry leaders. And to kind of help put that into perspective, the work that I do for my government clients is primarily in the fraud detection space, helping clients develop, test, and implement models that systematically flag things like identity theft or fraud or suspicious schemes. And with COVID, we saw a huge expansion of benefit programs, right? Things like stimulus checks, unemployment insurance expansion, small business assistance, renters assistance, just to name a few, which are great programs that helped a lot of people in need. But wherever there's opportunity for money to be paid out, you're always going to have, fraudsters trying to cash in. So to prevent that, we needed new models and detection mechanisms in place. But these models are, making pretty high stakes decisions that determine whether someone is going to get funding from the government that they may be entitled to, that they may really need in a timely manner. So there are, really, really significant implications to how these models perform, and having trustworthy frameworks embedded throughout the AI development process would ensure that these models are not biased, that they're performing as ethically and as responsibly as possible, so that government agencies can fulfill their mission of helping people, but also safeguarding their programs from being exploited by bad actors. Back over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Daisy. We'll go over to Tanya to introduce herself as well.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tanya Balsky. I'm a senior manager. I work mostly with federal healthcare clients. I also work a little bit with some state Medicaid programs and commercial healthcare companies. And I lead data science teams across a lot of places in there, including fraud, waste, and abuse, but also clinical quality and health equity. And I love Trustworthy AI in this space. It's been really important for the work that I've been doing because the clients that I work with need this in two places. One of them is that they are working really hard to understand how to regulate private companies that are doing AI work that affects healthcare every day in a variety of ways. So whether it's products that you wear on your wrist that track your heartbeat and a doctor sees it later, or it's different scans that might work differently on people with different skin tones. There are so many ways where AI is used in healthcare that's emerging, and they want to know how to regulate it to make sure it's safe and useful and accurate for everybody who's going to use it down the line across all of these factors, whether it's bias, whether it's accuracy, whether it's security, as you start to get into all these healthcare concerns. The other place that we use Trustworthy AI in that space is specifically with our government clients themselves, in terms of they are working on their own AI and machine learning projects to help them make better policy and understand how to serve people better. And as they do that, they have the same concerns, but they have to understand how to put their own safeguards together to do that. And given the mission and given the risks and payoffs of AI in this space, being able to help engage in creating that framework and that trust has been really important. And I'll pass to Anu.
Thanks, Tanya. Hey, everyone. I'm Ellan Seroja, and at Deloitte, I am one of the leads of the Trustworthy and Ethical Technology Program. It is one of our 5 core commitments under the Purpose Office, and here's where we are trying to adopt ethical tech behavior within the entire firm. And prior to this role, I led the operationalization efforts of Deloitte's trademark Trustworthy AI framework. So Trustworthy AI is really, really close to my heart, and I am so privileged to be on this panel. All right, so coming to impact of trust issues with AI. I want to go back maybe a year and a half when Deloitte publishes an annual report on state of AI in the enterprise. And for the 3rd edition that was published a little over a year ago, we surveyed more than 2,700 business executives that play an important role in AI adoption within their organizations. And what we found is that 95% of those respondents said that they have concerns about ethical risks that come with adoption of AI. However, only 1 in 5 respondents said that they had an ethical framework in place. So what this means is 80% of these organizations that are developing AI solutions do not have any type of framework to firstly identify ethical risks with their AI systems, let alone communicate and remediate those risks. That, to my mind, is the biggest issue. So, without a common framework and definitions around concepts such as bias, transparency, explainability, safety, and accountability, governments and businesses may be challenged to promote trust in their AI systems across their ecosystem of stakeholders. And then downstream, they may struggle to build the appropriate safeguards needed to ensure ethical use of AI. So without a common framework and lexicon, there will be obstacles to not just developing AI solutions that work for society, but a holistic approach to addressing issues that arise with AI.
Thank you. Thank all of you. We'll move on to the next question then. What are some of the barriers that you all have found when implementing trustworthy AI solutions? We'll go over to you, Tanya.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. And this one's a really tricky one because there are actually a lot of barriers to implementing this. And I think one of the fundamental ones is that you need a lot of awareness and buy-in and accountability for everybody who's involved in trustworthy AI at all levels, from the person doing the coding all the way up through the highest level oversight. And you need everybody to be aligned, as Anu said, on the framework that you're going to use to do that. You need everyone to be bought in on the importance. Obviously, people have deadlines, people have lots of things to do, and being really intentional about how you do this and accountable is really important for success. And any one person in the chain not being bought in or not being held accountable if they aren't bought in can pose a huge gap in terms of actionable results. And a big barrier to getting that piece of it done is also that there is a lack of knowledge and understanding in some of the departments in which AI work is being done or housed, that this is an issue and what the impacts of the issue are. So when we work with people on this, a lot of times they're surprised to hear about it. And when they hear about it, it immediately makes intuitive sense and they understand why it's important. But a lot of the people who have been running large IT departments, which is sometimes where this lives, are not aware. Sometimes data science sits in places like HR, where there may not be a general understanding of the opportunity and risk, and it's a team that sits off on its own, and there isn't really a kind of understanding about why it is. And so it's hard for a team of coders to communicate that importance and get that high-level buy-in to develop the structure around it and the resources around it that you need. And then the last piece that I think is an important barrier to talk about is that in order to do trustworthy AI and to really put safeguards in and be intentional and accountable about it, you need to be planning your resources appropriately. And those resources cover the spectrum of, have you built your technology in such a way that you can be as transparent as you want to be? Have you allocated enough time and staff to it to make that possible, including on a running basis once your algorithm is implemented and it's working, to check in and continue to monitor and improve on an ongoing basis? And have you invested in having diverse staff and diverse stakeholders to poke and prod at what you're doing to make sure that you are really doing a good job of not just looking at the work you've done and whether it's okay, but if there's something you missed and didn't include that you should have. And that piece, I think, is really critical, because often it's what you don't see that's the problem. The algorithms in and of themselves are neutral. The data that goes in is biased. The way we ask the questions can be biased. And so having those diverse points of view in the room and investing in getting that brain power is really important, and you have to prioritize it.
and I'll kind of just sort of pile on to something that Tanya had sort of hit on, which is diversity, in staffing diverse teams. I think that is kind of a very fundamental barrier, right, is just the lack of diversity in the AI workforce. And as we've come to learn, AI can be very vulnerable to bias. I think a really famous example of this is Amazon's AI recruiting tool. You might have heard of this. It's a tool that would crawl the web and find resumes and then evaluate those resumes and assign them a score, but it was trained on historical resumes that were submitted to the company. And, it was trained to identify candidates that shared similar resume characteristics to the candidates who were successfully hired at Amazon, who were predominantly men. So you can probably guess what the problem was there was this tool that they developed that basically discriminated against women, right? So algorithms can very easily and unintentionally learn bias from data that it's being trained on, and having technical teams with diverse members in charge of curating the data set and developing the model and QCing the model can help mitigate a lot of that risk. And, adopting these trustworthy AI frameworks certainly helps weed out some of those biases and vulnerabilities. But I think a really critical component of operationalizing that is adopting diverse and inclusive, governance and design practices throughout the AI development lifecycle.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So another barrier that we're seeing in most businesses today is that most of them are relegating trustworthy AI solutions to IT. And as Tanya mentioned, all employees of an organization and their vendors need to understand that they play a role in advancing ethical AI. And in my previous response, I mentioned that only 1 in 5 organizations have an ethical framework. But then if you double click on that, usually the ethical principles that are laid out in this framework are human-centric, which is understandable. But technologists that are building AI are not trained on practical usability of these ethical principles. And that's a gap in the market today. You need to have a multidisciplinary team. There are a multitude of startups that are creating toolkits to embed ethics and AI in the life cycle stages of AI. But what results are showing is that there is not a one-size-fits-all toolkit. So there is very low uptake by technologists building AI solutions. And one way this could be addressed, like both Tanya and Daisy mentioned, is to have a more diverse team that not just comprises of computer scientists and data scientists, but also sociologists, psychologists, ethicists. They can all come together during the conceptualization stages of the AI design and development. And this would then lead to building AI solutions that work for all of society, for its intended purposes, and therefore infuse trust in those AI solutions. And another barrier that businesses need to address is most of them that are developing AI solutions and bringing it to the marketplace do not have a governance board to monitor and address issues that may arise after the AI system is out in the marketplace. And as I mentioned, every employee has a role and responsibility in ethical AI use. What's lacking in AI ethics is not just so the internal processes within an organization needs to be embedded with AI ethics principles. And today there is no clear waypoint or opportunities for decision-making for not just in the development stages of AI, but also after deployment.
Thank you. The next question, the last question we have right now is, what would you share with rising women on what's helped fuel your success in the STEM career? Anu, let's start with you.
Sure. So I'm an engineer by training. My undergraduate degree is in computer science and my graduate degree is in data science. And after I reached a certain level at Deloitte, one of my mentors asked me what my brand was. And up until then, I was one of the go-to data scientists for model development and deployment and a successful project delivery. So I took a step back, introspected, and what I realized is that I am a pioneer by nature, always curious, wanting to learn and try new things. So applying that to my career as a data geek and technologist, the potential of what is possible with data and AI was always thrilling to me. But then I realized there are so many negative impacts this technology could have if we ignore the risks. And again, as a data scientist, I knew that there weren't enough technologists taking part in shaping this essential area of AI ethics. So I pivoted my career to build a brand for myself in the area of AI ethics, and that's what I bring to Deloitte and our clients today. And through this journey, I've learned a few things which I'd like to share. So firstly, pursue a career in STEM only if it motivates you and it is personally fulfilling to you, right? And once you start your career, if you have an idea, speak up. You're always going to be working in teams. And we are at a stage in technology today where we are solving some of the most complex problems in industry and society. So diversity of thoughts are key, right? And thirdly, look for mentors and sponsors. Wherever you are in your career journey, you need to have a network of people you can lean on for professional advice, for career opportunities, and also expanding your skill set. You will very soon in your career realize that learning does not stop after graduation. And lastly, as a woman in STEM, there's very few of us, by the way, external validation is hard to come by. So focus on surrounding yourself with supportive colleagues and also extending that support to all the women around you.
Thank you, Anu. Let's pass it over to Daisy.
Thanks, Lauren. And Anya, those were really, really great tips. Just to kind of reiterate some of the points that she had made on mentorship. That was something that was really, really helpful for me. I've been, I think, very lucky in my career in being able to find good mentors. And I know it's something that women in STEM particularly struggle with because, there aren't very many women in STEM. And working in analytics, I didn't have, female mentors for a lot of my career. But I did have some fantastic male mentors and leaders pretty early on who sponsored me, who were really invested in my career development, who, encouraged me to fight for a pay raise that I absolutely deserved. And now that I'm a little bit more seasoned in my career, I feel, really compelled to kind of pay that forward in providing mentorship, especially to younger women professionals in my community.
Thanks, Daisy. Anything else you want to add to that, Tanya?
Sure, I would echo what both Anu and Daisy said. I'll also add that being successful as a woman in the STEM field for me has included being very intentional about who I work with and where I spend my time, and making sure that I'm not spending too much time in places where I don't feel valued. And that's been something that's been easier to do as I've become more seasoned. But I really, to the extent that I can, try to set myself and my teams up for success by making sure that everybody who we're working with, to the extent possible, is going to be supportive and growing each other, and that we're not spending all our energy fighting against that in the workplace as we're building what we want to build. So there are lots of places where you will be welcomed and you will thrive. There are increasingly large numbers of women in data science and of people who are aware of the challenges that women face in data science. So I would say to the extent you can, look for places where you want to be, that want you to be there as you grow.
Thank you. Those are all very great tips. I appreciate them as well. We have a couple questions from the audience. If you have more questions, definitely type them into the Q&A. But the first question we have is for Tanya. So Tanya, you mentioned having to get by and when working toward implementing Trustworthy AI. How have you been successful in doing this?
That's a great question. And for me, it's worked in a couple of different ways. One of them is that when I hire people and when I choose people to work on specific projects, we start out with a selection criteria that include being curious and wanting to work not just on the problem from a technology and implementation perspective, but also from wanting to solve the problem at hand and being willing to think about the context and work in an interdisciplinary way to understand how that solution needs to be built. So I think that sometimes as data scientists, we get really enamored with learning a new methodology or the coolness or the shininess of a particular project from a technology standpoint. And it's easy to fall into that. But I try and select specifically for people who are also willing to engage in the context as they implement when I staff my teams and when I work on my projects. When I'm working with clients, I have had some success by providing examples of projects that have gone wrong, which sounds a little bit old, perhaps. But for example, I work in healthcare, and a lot of my work is related to health equity, which has a huge AI component. And there are some very public examples of times when bias in data or a question that's answered incorrectly in a build has gone wrong. For example, there was a very prevalent algorithm on the market for a few years that included race in the features when it was prioritizing who needed to be seen first at the ER. But of course, our historical data is biased, and so people who were Black were getting seen more slowly at the same level of acuteness or the same level of illness as compared to their white counterparts. And so not doing all the checks on how you're asking the question, on what's in your data, on how the results are coming out from that ethical lens has a really big impact and a really big risk for an organization. So going through examples like that and explaining how it can go wrong and how bad it can be if it goes wrong has been very effective at getting people on board.
Thanks, Tanya. Next question is open to everyone. How did you all end up in your roles at Deloitte? Could you share how you landed your positions?
I can go first with this one. So I have sort of a non-traditional data science background. As I mentioned earlier in my intro, I kind of studied economics and math. For a little bit of time, was actually considering doing a PhD and kind of going the academia route, but sort of found consulting and really fell in love with it. And when I started consulting, I started at a smaller, I wouldn't call it a boutique firm. It's pretty mid-sized. There are about 2,000 people who work there. And it was a really wonderful firm, but it was still a little bit smaller for me. And Deloitte being so big and having such a robust analytics community of practice, I knew that if I really wanted to develop my career in analytics, I would have to go somewhere like Deloitte to be able to do that. So kind of started my career really doing a little bit more of the operations research, math modeling sort of work, and then kind of pivoted into analytics right as it was getting really, really hot. And I had a lot of the skill sets needed to be a data scientist. Did an interview with a couple of folks at Deloitte. Tanya actually interviewed me and hired me. So that's where I've been since.
So for me, I knew that my passion was in math and science. So after computer science, I worked a couple of years doing tech implementations, and I went back to pursue my master's in data science. But during my second year of grad school, most of my classmates were interested to work for tech companies. But I did want to get a flavor for what it's like to be a data scientist across industries. So that was my key factor to joining consulting, because Deloitte consultants that are data scientists work across all six sectors. And then that's the experience that I wanted when I started. But then, of course, we're in a disruptive technology, right? So as I progressed through my career at Deloitte, I found my niche with AI and ethics.
I love that. I also came into it from a non-traditional background. My master's is in healthcare policy, and I thought that I was going to spend my career working for nonprofits. And as I got deeper and deeper into econometrics and analytics, I realized that I was outgrowing the data science capacity of the organizations that I wanted to work with, and that if I wanted to go further down that path, I was going to need to reroute a little bit. And so I wound up in consulting to get that balance of working for the mission that I cared about and being able to have a bigger toolbox and more resources to go after the kinds of impact I wanted to make. And I started off at a smaller firm, and then as Deloitte started to grow their healthcare practice, they brought me on.
Awesome, thank you. I know we've heard a couple examples, but do we have any examples of ethical AI gone wrong and the impact of that? No examples.
I mean, all of mine are healthcare related, so I was going to be a little bit quiet to give folks a chance to weigh in. But I can tell you that it's impacted things like in healthcare, it's impacted things like radiology and interpretation of scans and whether it is accurate for all people or not. In the COVID-19 epidemic, some of the earlier tests on blood oxygen saturation that were supposed to be read remotely and remotely monitored for sicker patients didn't work well with people with darker skin because the AI was developed on lighter skinned people. So, and also there are lots of examples on things like skin scans for skincare health conditions where it's been really ineffective for some people and not others. Studies on genetics and genetic conditions historically have been impacted by this because there aren't as many women in the test data sets, and it can manifest a little bit different conditions can manifest differently in women than men. And so not every algorithm in healthcare used for diagnostics or research is specified correctly in a way that will adequately diagnose and treat women. So there are kind of a host of examples in that healthcare space of gone wrong with negative health impact. Sorry, go ahead.
I can share a non-healthcare example with discriminatory AI. So here's a scenario. So person one, he almost stole a bike that was worth $80. And person two stole tools from a hardware store worth $86, okay? Previous history of person one showed that he had, the person had 4 juvenile misdemeanors, and a previous history of person two showed that this person had spent 5 years in prison for armed robbery. The judge assigned a risk score for these two scenarios. Person one received a risk score of 8 out of 10, and person two received a risk score of 3 out of 10. Now, the two facts that went into this decision making, person one is a Black woman, and person two is a white man. And the second fact is that the judge here is an AI software. Right. So this is really, really problematic because you know that once AI is deployed, it's learning with new data. If there were enough guardrails in place to ensure that the new data sets that were getting fed were balanced, you would not have the scenario like this.
Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions. One, do ethical AI considerations come up against or in tension with agile fail-fast frameworks?
The easy answer is yes. Yes, they definitely do. the way that we've worked with that in some of my projects is by building it into the sprint reviews, so that it's its own track, that it's tracked separately, and that you have to pass those considerations for those milestones as part of the sprint QA gate and the sprint close. So when I was talking earlier about what some of the challenges and the resources are and the resourcing needs are and why that's a barrier, that's part of it, is you have to plan for it as part of those sprints. I can't say that in a project where it's been planned for, it has been any more of a holdup than any of the other factors that you consider in an agile framework, but it does sometimes hold things up, and it does have to be absolutely planned for, especially in that framework. So that's a great question. I love that question.
I would say too, there is sort of an argument to be made about adopting Trustworthy AI enterprise-wide and facilitating, more consistency and standardization and kind of evaluation of your models, right? So including ethical evaluations on top of performance evaluations, and enabling more confidence in decisions. And that, I think, in a way, could potentially even speed up, your production timeline there. So I think there is sort of this misconception that with a lot of these sort of embedded review processes and all these other frameworks that it's slowing things down and it's a lot of red tape. But I think in some instances you could argue that it is actually helping speed things up and getting more research projects out of R&D and into production.
Thanks, Daisy. Thanks, Tanya. One last question we have. What are some of the tactical considerations we should keep in mind to build ethical AI into our modeling efforts?
I can start with this one. I think some of the tactical considerations, we've kind of already hit on this, are things like, standardization and how we're evaluating AI against some of our pillars. So when we're, determining whether or not a model is fair or ethical, what do we mean by that, right? Is my understanding and interpretation of fair and ethical consistent with another project team that might be building a similar AI model? I think another consideration is scalability of your Trustworthy AI solution, because I don't know that it's reasonable to expect organizations to completely overhaul their entire AI development process to adopt Trustworthy AI frameworks and best practices. And especially with our government clients, that approach would never work, right? Their agencies are so large and complex, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. There are different stakeholders with different interests, and you kind of have to meet them where they're at. So what we've been doing is we've been sort of laying out a roadmap for them, right? Here's where we start. Here are a couple of practical use cases that we can kind of tackle slowly and then sort of scale up from there, right? So adopting a more sort of incremental, phased, scalable solution, I think, is something that is more realistically achievable and also more palatable for our clients.
Thanks, Daisy. Tanya, Anu, anything else to add to that? Or all right. Well, thank you to our panelists for answering all of those questions. It was very informative. I hope all of you got a lot out of that discussion. So thank you for everyone for joining as well. I don't see any more questions that came in, so we can go ahead and end. But again, thank you so much.